The habitats will vary depending on where you are on Earth. So in the tropics, like around an estuary, you can find like mangrove forests, whereas like in the temperate and subpolar regions, you can find like salt marshes. Okay, so we're going to talk in general about some of the habitats that you can find, but just know that those habitats can be like mixed and matched depending on where you are on Earth. Okay, so one of the habitats that you'll find, and well, this one's in all estuaries, is the subtidal region of the estuary. The subtidal region is the region that is always underwater. Okay, many parts of an estuary can actually be intertidal, get covered and uncovered by the tides, but the subtidal region is always underwater. This is going to make up the main part of the estuary, the main body of the estuary, and then anything that is like a tidal channel, like branches off of the main estuary, that are always underwater. So this is like one of the critical habitats for things that survive around an estuary or in an estuary, because this is where many things are going to live. And it's also critical for many of our commercial species. So the species that we hunt or fish in order to eat, they actually spend a lot of their life here in an estuary. They actually like spend their baby years in an estuary until they reach a certain size, and then they move out into the open ocean. So the subtidal region of the estuary is important for us and our food source as well. Okay, so yeah, about 3/4 of our commercial species spend part of their life in an estuary. Oyster reefs are another habitat. Okay, oyster reefs. Oyster reefs are formed from oysters, and they're formed when oysters start growing on top of each other and cementing to each other. And as they grow on top of each other and cement to each other, they form like a whole reef structure. So it's kind of like a coral reef, but not formed out of coral, formed out of oysters. Yeah. It's more rare to find them on the West Coast. They're a lot of times, yeah, these are mostly found on the East Coast. This is where you'd go, like if you want to go and get, oysters for dinner, okay, or search for a pearl, something like that. Okay, so these are intertidal. So these are areas that will be covered and uncovered by the tides. Okay, covered and uncovered by the tides. So this is at low tide. This is like when it's exposed. Okay, and it's going to provide a habitat for a lot of things, protection from predators. That's what they look like. That's a close-up. Okay. The next habitat that you'll find, or you can find, is a mudflat. Okay, mudflats are oftentimes intertidal as well. Okay, so they're a lot of times intertidal. You'll see in the video that you'll watch tomorrow, they'll have a section where you'll see like the mud flats. The mud flats have lots of animals that burrow into them. And so when it's low tide, all the animals like burrow into there, like worms and clams and stuff like that. And then lots of birds come to feed on the mud flats during this time. And then at high tide, when the water comes in, the animals crawl out and they move around and they feed, and ocean predators come up to eat them. So it's actually a good food source for a lot of different things. Mud flats are exactly what they sound like. They're big flat areas of mud. Okay, so here's what they look like. Okay, so you've got mud flat, mud flat, mud flat. Okay, this is to kind of show you types of things that would be buried in the dirt there. Mud flats a lot of times are actually like found with salt marshes. So, oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Here. So if this is like the main body of the estuary and our water, okay, this would be the mud flat area. That would be the intertidal, right? So it'd be covered and uncovered by the tides. And then above the mud flat, we would find salt marshes. All right? Yes? Okay. Okay, so we have been talking about the intertidal zone and estuaries. We've and we've talked about the rocky intertidal zone and the sandy intertidal zone. And then last class, we started talking about estuaries. And the three characteristics that you have to be considered an estuary would be semi-enclosed, two types of water, the fresh and the salt water, and then mixing between those two types of water. So we talked about the 4 different kinds of estuaries and how they're formed, and then we looked at how water mixes in estuaries, and then we started looking at the different types of habitats that you'll find in an estuary. And one of the types of habitats that you would find would be an oyster reef. You also have like the subtidal region, which would be the region that would be underwater all the time. And then another type of habitat that can be associated with estuaries would be a mud flat. And a mud flat is simply exactly what it sounds like. It's a big flat area of the land that is covered in mud. And mud flats are oftentimes intertidal, so the mud flats get covered and uncovered by the tides every day, either once a day or twice a day, depending on the tidal pattern. And the mud flats are actually a very important habitat for lots of things that live in estuaries, because this is an area where burrowing animals can survive. So you'll have all sorts of worms and clams and all different kinds of crustaceans that will live in the mud flats. They'll come up to the surface to feed like when the tide is high, and they'll be moving around and eating as it's high tide. When it becomes low tide, the animals burrow into the sand to wait out the low tide and wait for the next high tide. The animals that live here are an important food source for lots of different things, like birds, and even some land predators will come out onto the mud flats in order to feed. And then in high tides, you'll also have fish and crabs that will move up and feed on the animals that live here as well. So mud flats are one type of habitat. And these pictures are to show you what a mud flat looks like. So they can be vast expanses that surround the subtidal region of the estuary. The picture in the upper left, that would be a picture there to help you see the different kinds of things that would live in those areas and how they would be burrowed down into the sand or mud. Other habitats that you'll find in subtidal regions, you'll oftentimes find seagrass beds in estuaries. Remember, seagrass is a primary producer. We talked about it last semester. And so you can find seagrass beds in estuaries. These are mainly subtidal, so they're going to be underwater. They're not really going to be exposed to the air. And seagrass beds are very, very important for a lot of different reasons. One of the reasons is they provide food for lots of different animals. They also help to provide protection from predators for many different animals and a place to live. So food, protection, and a habitat. Again, subtidal regions of some estuaries. Another type of habitat you'll find around estuaries are marshes. We also talked about salt marshes briefly last semester. Remember, salt marshes are made out of like rushes and all sorts of different kinds of plants that can withstand a certain amount of salt. And marshes are intertidal, so they do get covered and uncovered by the tides, and they tend to be around the edges of an estuary. Also, review from last semester, 4 things that are important that marshes do. They are a nursery, a sponge, a food source, and a filter. Okay? I'm not going to go over all of those things again because we talked about that extensively last semester, but you do need to remember those 4 reasons why marshes are important, because you will see them again on your quiz and on your test. So please remember why marshes are important. Nursery for lots of things. They help to reduce coastal flooding, provide a food source, and they filter out pollutants. Point Mugu Lagoon in Ventura is actually the largest functioning salt marsh in Southern California. So if you go to Point Mugu Lagoon, you can see what a salt marsh looks like and see lots of cool animals probably. So here's a picture to help you see all the grasses and stuff that will form the salt marsh are pictured there. And then you can see all sorts of different kinds of animals that would be living in those salt marshes. Remember, salt marshes are found only in temperate regions, so you will only find them like around where we are and kind of in the higher latitudes, whereas you find mangrove forests in the tropics. So the mangrove forests are the tropical equivalent of the salt marshes. And so around estuaries in the tropics, you can find mangrove forests.